While I agree that colonialism is a very important part of British history, calling the artifacts stolen through violence and repression by the British would serve to legitimize how they were acquired. Good evening, everybody. I would like to first start by thanking the President for this opportunity to speak today and to congratulate him and his officers on the stellar term that we have had so far. As it is well known, the British Museum is one of the largest museums in the world, with approximately 8 million works of art and artifacts from cultures across the world, many of which were taken from other countries during the British Empire. While these artifacts are often celebrated as a part of British culture, in my view, they are about as British as Yorkshire tea. Today, I stand before you to argue in favor of the claim that the British Museum is not very British. As the true PPE student that I am, I will first attempt to define what it means to be British in the context of this debate. And then I will present my argument, which is that while the artifacts are situated in Britain, they are instead a blatant display of colonialism, which the British Museum flaunts as British culture. These are the matters I will address in my argument today, but before I do, I have the pleasure of introducing the opposition for tonight. So speaking first on the opposition is Mr. Shamar Price, our #1 BNOC on the Chairwell list. He is a member of the Standing Committee and a third-year PPE student at our shared home University College. Much like the British Museum holds on to its past, Shamar has not quite managed to let go of his time here at Oxford. He not only ran for student union president, but upon losing, he has rusticated, all in attempt to delay his graduation. Now, seeing that many of the British Museum's artifacts were taken with such an iron fist, it's unsurprising to see Shamar on this side of this debate. He is not only the self-proclaimed supreme leader of the William Beveridge Society, but he has also given himself the title of JCR President Emeritus. Nonetheless, I believe that Shamar is an extremely worthy opponent, and I look forward to hearing his arguments today. Speaking second on opposition is Mr. Gary Vickan. He's a distinguished author and a former director of the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. With a keen eye for artistic treasures and a penchant for scholarly discourse, it's definitely an honor to be speaking against him today. Although, in his book, Sacred and Stolen, he reveals the dark past of looted antiquities housed in museums. It seems that he is faced with the unenviable task of convincing us, and maybe himself, that finders are really keepers. Lastly, in opposition, we have Honourable Willie Jackson, MP. He is a New Zealand MP, and he is the first person of Maori descent to debate at the Oxford Union, who I am proud to say that I invited. He has long been an advocate for social justice and has even advocated for repatriation. So it must come as a surprise to see Willie on this side of the debate. However, I still look forward to hearing what I'm sure will be an extremely thought-provoking perspective. Mr. President, these are your speakers, and they are most welcome. So there has been growing debate over whether the museum truly represents British history and culture. But what do we truly mean by the term British? Would we suggest, for instance, that international cuisines, which have over time become staples in the British diet, are in fact British? Well, in one sense, yes, because over time they've been integrated into British culture. But in another, the original products retain the identity of their countries of origin. A key distinction between spreading cultures and appropriating cultural artifacts is that one involves exclusive ownership and the other can be shared. The British Museum reflects Britain's imperial past rather than its national identity. These artifacts were acquired during a time when the nation was determined to expand its power and influence rather than cultivate its own cultural heritage. So in calling the institutions British, we would be doing so at the expense of the cultures that Britain subjugated. If we were to claim, as the opposition aims to convince us today, that the British Museum is very British, it would have to be the case, surely, that its collections predominantly came from British Isles or were originally owned by Britain. In looking at the makeup of the British Museum, using the museum's database, over 70% of the items are acquired from other countries. Now, the opposition may argue that because some of these artifacts were taken as a product of British colonialism, their place in the museums represent British history and is therefore British. While I agree that colonialism is a very important part of British history, calling the artifacts stolen through violence and repression by the British would serve to legitimize how they were acquired. The opposition surely cannot claim that it is British to unethically hold onto artifacts which deny communities vital connections to their past. It is one thing for the museum to house collections of international objects that have been acquired peacefully and consensually. But even here, the British Museum can hardly make this claim due to the volume of goods that have been looted under the British Empire. Often, empires are held together through violence and repression, and the British Empire was no exception to this. Today, we claim that the British Empire is long gone, and yet its treacheries remain. For instance, take one of the objects that are really contended and are actually quite close to home, considering that I am someone of Nigerian descent, the Benin bronzes. The Benin bronzes, during the 19th century, were looted. And so the Kingdom of Benin, which was rich in natural resources, initially engaged in trade with the British. The Oba of Benin halted all trade with the British merchants amongst escalating tensions and racial disputes. In response, James Robert Phillips embarks on an expedition with the covert intention of conquering Benin City and dethroning its king. Wrongly anticipating little resistance, the Kingdom of Benin quickly mobilized against Phillips' party, defeating the British with only 2 European survivors. Now, in response, a punitive expedition resulted in the capturing of Benin City, the looting of its royal palace, and the seizure of thousands of priceless artifacts, including the renowned Benin bronzes. Approximately 40% of these stolen artifacts were allocated to the British museums, with the remainder dispersed globally. Now, in light of these facts and these stolen goods, the announcement last year that several items had been stolen from the British Museum itself was somewhat ironic. The Benin bronzes are one of many examples of stolen goods, as we know from dispute over the Parthenon marbles and many other artifacts. Thus, the British Museum is not only compiled with non-British collections, but also showcases the spoils of the empire itself. It is no secret that many have called for the repatriation of cultural artifacts to their countries of origin, but in many cases, this seems unlikely. Instead, the museum proposes alternative arrangements. For example, the Digital Benin Initiative, an online tool and a database of historical objects. Now, this appears to be a position which acknowledges Benin's claim to the ownership of these goods. However, it's only a half-hearted solution. Much like the recent deal with Ghana and the British Museum to loan 32 golden artifacts that were stolen by the British from Ghana. Now, claiming that these goods are British is equivalent to suggesting that a thief who steals a valuable good from you, then lists it in their inventory, is the rightful owner of this property. We cannot accept this. Surely it would be more British to focus on the means and the weapons that British used to acquire these goods rather than housing the stolen goods themselves. Considering the number of these goods stored in the British Museum, I would even go as far to say it would be better off to call it the World Museum or returning the artifacts to their rightful owners. No, thank you. I will end by addressing a potential counter-argument. The opposition may attempt to highlight that in many world museums, including those in the US, France, and Germany, they also hold artifacts from different countries, which reflects a common practice in museum creation. And so the British Museum is unique in this regard. It's not unique in this regard. While I agree that the concept of a universal museum should provide a narrative of human history, as I've said earlier, the British Museum's possession of these artifacts is not simply a matter of curation, but is deeply rooted in historical injustice, which differentiates it from other institutions. For example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which makes a concerted effort to acquire artifacts through consensual means. The motion at hand is not that the British Museum is not very universal. It is that the British Museum is not very British. And even the British Museum itself labels its uniqueness in bringing together the cultures of the world under one roof. In other words, according to the British Museum, what makes their collection special is how far beyond British borders it ventures. It seems that even the British Museum would somewhat agree with this motion. And so, I ask our honorable members, what is something that feels British, but just isn't? If I have convinced you today that the answer to this question is the British Museum, I urge you to vote in favor of the motion. Thank you.